Good afternoon. As the rector of St. Paul's College, I welcome everyone to this third and final lecture of the 2021 Hanley Lecture Series. Before we begin, St. Paul's College, the University of Manitoba, and our city of Winnipeg sit at the crossroads of the Anishinaabe, Métis, Cree, Dakota, and Oji-Cree nations. We acknowledge specifically that we are in Treaty 1 territory and on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We are committed to the pathways of reconciliation, and we hope all those participating in today's lecture are able to join St. Paul's College in these endeavors. Once again, we welcome Dr. Kathleen Sprows Cummings as our 2021 Hanley Lecturer. For those who are not present for the first two lectures, which can be easily found on YouTube, I want to say a few words about the Hanley Lecture Series and its creation. John Hanley, known by many as Jack, was born in Winnipeg in 1910. He attended St. Paul's for 1 year of high school and then St. Jerome's College in Waterloo, followed by the Grand Seminary in Montreal. At the age of 23, he joined the Jesuits and studied philosophy at the Jesuit Seminary in Toronto. He was ordained a priest in 1945. After completing his studies, in 1949, he returned to Winnipeg, where he taught both high school and university courses at the college. From 1959 until the end of the 1960s, he restricted his teaching to the university courses here at St. Paul's College. At the early age of 60, he died of a brain tumor, and his funeral mass was held in our St. Paul's College Christ the King Chapel. To honor the memory of Father John Hanley, S.J., his friends and colleagues at St. Paul's College and the Department of Religion at the University of Manitoba established the Hanley Memorial Lecture Series that was in 1980. This prestigious Hanley Lecture Series annually brings to Winnipeg someone who is either a prominent theologian, scripture scholar, or a leading authority on current religious issues. Please be advised that this event is being recorded. At the end of the lecture, you will be able to pose questions. Simply indicate your question in the Q&A on the Zoom feature, or those on Facebook who are attending this lecture, please type your question and our technicians will advise us of the question you're asking. So before I introduce Dr. Cummings, the director of the Jesuit Center for Catholic Studies here at St. Paul's College, Dr. Daniel McLeod, will say a few words about the Hanley Award, which is given to one of our exceptional students each year.
Hi, I'm here to present the 2021 Hanley Scholarship to a fantastic student of ours at the college, Lumiere Perennis. Lumiere is in her fourth year, a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology, and she's doing a minor in Catholic Studies. She'll graduate this year and pursue a career in medicine. In many ways, Lumiere embodies so many of the great qualities we hope to see in our students, and she has brought a great deal to the college and to our program over the last number of years. Around this time last year, Lumiere was my student, and we were all sitting around in class wondering whether classes were going to get canceled, and people were saying, no, it's not going to get canceled, and others were saying, yes, it's going to get canceled, and Lumiere stopped us all as a microbiologist and said, this virus has an R value of 3. We're definitely stopping classes. So then I went back to my office, found out what the R value was, and then continued with the end of class. Lumiere does not hide her talents or her light under the bushel. She volunteers with Children's Hospital here in Winnipeg with the St. Paul's College Student Council, and has been an exemplary teaching assistant in our Catholic Studies program for over 2 years. She's on the call today, although her face is not here. So please join me in congratulating this fantastic student who will go on to do great, great things and represent our college and our Catholic Studies program very, very well. So congratulations to Lumiere.
Thank you, Daniel. And congratulations to Lumiere on receiving this great award. Congratulations. Now, about our Hanley Lecture, for those who are unable to attend the first two lectures, Kathleen Sprows Cummings is Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Notre Dame, where she also directs the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism. Dr. Sprows Cummings' most recent book, A Saint of Our Own, How the Quest for a Holy Hero Helped Catholics Become American, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019. She is also the author of New Women of the Old Faith, Gender and American Catholicism in the Progressive Era, which was published in 2009. Dr. Cummings is often asked to comment on issues pertaining to Catholicism and other areas of her expertise. This includes interviews with NBC, the New York Times, and a few months ago, even the Winnipeg Free Press, when she was interviewed by our faith columnist, Brenda Studerman, here in Winnipeg. I now welcome Dr. Kathleen Sprows Cummings to give the third of 3 Hanley lectures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. It's wonderful to be back with you virtually. And I also want to thank again, Jason and Matt, for all they do to make this possible, this connection. And also extend my congratulations to Lumiere. That's a wonderful honor. It was a delight to hear. I have enjoyed the time I've spent with you virtually, but obviously I'm disappointed that I didn't get the chance to visit for many reasons. One of which is that I missed an opportunity to visit the shrine of Blessed Vasil Velichkovsky in Winnipeg at St. Joseph's Ukrainian Catholic Church. Blessed Vasil is not someone I knew a lot about, but he has a wonderful story that many of you I know. But I'll share a little bit of that story in case you don't. But I'm also going to make the point that the former Speaker of the House in the United States, Tip O'Neill, always said that all politics is local. And I like to paraphrase that by saying all holiness is local, that we encounter the holy on a local level. So Vasil Velichkovsky is your local saint, and I understand the shrine is just a marvelous place, and I hope I get a chance to visit it in person someday. So I will be speaking about him, not so much his life, but his afterlife, as I said in my first lecture, the way he is remembered and the way he's been honored by the church as a person who is at this point beatified by the church. So let me start my screen sharing there. So this was the first screen. So this lecture, the final in the series, is called John Paul II and All the Saints. And I won't be talking about all the saints that Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, canonized or beatified. That will be impossible. But in just a minute, I'm going to turn to Blessed Vasil to illustrate what are some of the main developments during the pontificate of Pope John Paul II as they relate to canonization, and how they really are quite remarkable. And as you'll see, it's not necessary to have listened to the first 2 lectures in the series, but if you did, you'll see that many of the threads that I laid out in those first 2 will kind of come to fruition in this era, the era of John Paul II. When John Paul II died in April 2005, crowds at his funeral chanted Santo Subito, translated sainthood now or sainthood immediately. And what they were asking was, what his devotees were asking was that his successor eliminate what was then a 5-year requirement to wait to initiate a cause until 5 years after a person died. They were essentially asking Pope Benedict to return to an early practice of the church where saints were named by popular affirmation, long before there was this convoluted process that I've been alluding to in various ways in the previous 2 lectures. The new Pope, the former Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, decided not to forgo the process, but he did waive that 5-year waiting period and open the cause for canonization just days after his predecessor's death. And of course, it succeeded in record time. John Paul II was beatified in May 2001 and canonized in beatified in May 2011 and canonized in April 2014. He, in addition to being a saint himself, he named many saints. John Paul II canonized 482 people, which is more saints than all of his predecessors combined. That's a little misleading in the sense that it only refers to all of his predecessors since 1588, which is when the modern process of canonization was developed. But nevertheless, it's quite a high number. And he beatified 1,341. And I think that's really important not to overlook because as I've mentioned before, beatification permits veneration for a segment of the local church. So it's why Blessed Basil has a shrine in Winnipeg. He is a saint to you. In this sense, canonization is like the frosting on the cake. It's wonderful. It universalizes holiness from the local church. But for the people who are closest to the saint, it's the beatification that is the most meaningful thing. And really a lot of heavy lifting in the process is already done by beatification. All you need to get from beatification to canonization now is one miracle. And although there's a lot that people on earth can do to hasten that, it really is something largely beyond human control. At least that's the idea. So I think this number is really important for a couple of reasons. What I hope to do in this final lecture in the series is explore the why, the how, the who, and the so what. What were John Paul II's reasons for canonizing so many? What modifications to the process made this even possible? Who were some of the people he raised to the honors of the altar, in effect, creating a revised geography of holiness in the Catholic Church? And then finally, why does it matter? And to do that, I'm going to end with a deep dive into a person from the United States that he both beatified and canonized, Catherine Drexel. Of these 482, only 2 people were from the United States. I mentioned the first one in my second lecture, Philippine Duchesne, but I'm going to take a deeper dive into Catherine Drexel and talk about her really complicated legacy in 2021. And then finally, John Paul II himself, and talk about how his legacy has been recently complicated as a saint. But I know as I said, you're very interested in Blessed Basil, and he is a very interesting and admirable person, a native of Western Ukraine, who studied and he was ordained a deacon in 1923, entered the Redemptorists. So this picture here is from four of the 28 Ukrainian Catholic martyrs that were that were beatified in June of 2001. They're all members of the Redemptorist order, which is an order I know well from their work in the United States and from one of their US saints as well, John Newman. Blessed Basil taught at the minor seminary after his ordination and worked as a missionary in rural Ukraine. He was arrested in 1945 and condemned to death. That sentence was commuted to 10 years imprisonment, and he was released in 1955. He was consecrated a bishop in a hotel room in Moscow in 1963 and became the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Ukraine. Arrested once again in 1969, he spent 3 years in prison. Near death in the spring of 1972, he was exiled from Ukraine, but invited to Winnipeg in part because of the large population of Ukrainian Catholics there, and he died there in 1973. He is, along with his confreres, considered a martyr for his death at the hands of communists. What my main point, though, is that his beatification illustrates so many important points about John Paul II's approach to saint-making. Number one, I mentioned it was a group of 28. So all 28 were beatified at the same time as a collective. So not unlike the North American martyrs who I talked about, the Canadian martyrs for this audience, who were canonized, beatified in 1925 and canonized in 1930 as a group. And in order to make a case for a joint cause for beatification and canonization, there has to be some link between them. And you can see in this case, just from these 4, it was not the time or place of their death. They all died in different years and in different places. But it really was their connection to having sacrificed their lives rather than renounce their faith to, as John Paul II said in his beatification homily, the infamous Nazi and communist ideologies. So he linked them as martyrs to some of the atrocities of the 20th century, which of course John Paul II himself had lived. So this is a way that it's emblematic. So first of all, the grouping, that 482 canonizations he canonized 482 people. That doesn't mean there were 482 canonization ceremonies. There were actually only 111 canonizations that took place. And that's because so many were in these large groups and almost always martyrs of different places. John Paul II adopted a more generous definition of martyrdom than had been used in the past, encompassing not only those who perished solely because of hatred of the faith, but those who died defending truth and human dignity. So fully 83% of John Paul II's saints were considered martyrs, and about 77% of the people he declared blessed. So quite a large number of martyrs. So that's why the Ukrainian Catholic martyrs were quite emblematic. John Paul II had studied acting before he became a priest, and he really understood so well the symbolic power of canonization, what it meant, what it could signify to name new saints from a population that did not previously have one, or from a population that he wanted to draw closer to the Roman Catholic Church. And this was surely the case here. The beatification of these men, well, these were men, but the group included women as well, was connected to his attempt to end the 1,000-year schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, which was a constant theme of his visit to Ukraine. In his homily, the Pope urged the crowd to see the martyr sacrifice as a pressing call for reconciliation and unity. During the last centuries, he said, too many stereotyped ways of thinking, too much mutual resentment, and too much intolerance have accumulated. The only way to clear the path is to forget the past, ask forgiveness of one another, and forgive one another, he said. So he was very consciously using the beatification of the Ukrainian martyrs as a way to work toward Christian unity. And that doesn't mean that they weren't holy. Using something, I've tried to make this point before, that just because it's assigned other meaning doesn't detract from the holiness of the people being honored. But this is what John Paul II understood far better than any of his predecessors. Finally, as I said, this beatification happened in Ukraine. Fuori sede is the Italian phrase that refers to outside the walls of the Vatican. And this was another practice of John Paul II, another innovation of John Paul II. During a visit to the Philippines in 1981, he had presided at the beatification of Lorenzo Ruiz and other martyrs. Ruiz had become the first Filipino so recognized. And this would be the first of eventually 61 Fuori sede beatifications, of which the Ukrainian martyrs were one. 3 years after that beatification, John Paul II canonized 103 Korean victims of anti-Christian persecution, so in Seoul. And so that was the first of his eventually 14 Fuori sede canonizations. So those are just the ways in which Blessed Vasil's story of his path to beatification was really emblematic of what Pope John Paul II was trying to achieve. Now, it's not, as I said, it's not necessary to have listened to the previous two lectures, but if you have, you'll see that so many of those first causes introduced from the United States and Canada came to fruition during the pontificate of John Paul II. I mentioned these three women. All of their causes were introduced in the 1880s and 90s in an attempt to redress what US and Canadian Catholics saw as an imbalance between the 17 men and women canonized from Mexico, Central and South America, and the 0 causes being considered at the time from either the United States or Canada. Marguerite Bourgeois was the third saint he canonized. Marie of the Incarnation was one of his early blesseds. And in fact, she was beatified on the same day of a saint that we have talked a great deal about, Kateri Tekakwitha, who he beatified in 1980, waiving the requirement for a miracle in part to lift up Indigenous Catholics in North America. This slide appeared in my last presentation, and I didn't have time to explain it, but this is A stained glass window featuring Blessed Tekakwitha in a parish in Three Rivers, Massachusetts, a rural parish in Western Massachusetts, and the name of the saint and Isaiah, a verse from Isaiah, are written in Polish. And I just love this because it just illustrates the fluidity of ethnic representations of saints. You may remember that in the first lecture, I mentioned this petition that US bishops sent to the Vatican in 1884, noting that the Canadian bishops had sent an identical petition asking for the initiation of the causes of Tekakwitha and the Jesuit martyrs, with a view to affording the United States and Canada native patrons, holy people who had lived, died, and sanctified themselves in the United States, as John Gilmary Shea put it, among circumstances familiar. This is the primary reason why John Paul II canonized so many. He grasped that desire that was so palpable in the United States and Canada in the late 19th century for a saint of their own, a saint who had lived among them. And many of his many of the people he canonized were from places that had not previously had a saint. Now, this was a critique that had surfaced before John Paul, a critique of saint making process that had surfaced before John Paul II's pontificate at the Second Vatican Council. Cardinal Soenens of Belgium had pointed out that 90% of canonized saints came from just 3 European nations. And surely holiness was represented in different ways throughout the world, and it should be recognized. So those canonizations from the Philippines, from Korea, from many places really did diversify the canon of the saints, and really tried to reflect the church's global reach, which John Paul II did through his travels as well. So, and he often tried to time a beatification or canonization with his travels to kind of reinforce the message. Cardinal Soenens in Vatican II also channeled Edward McSweeney, who was a priest I mentioned from the United States, who in 1890 had urged the Holy See to validate the hidden saints from the countries who were too poor to stand the expense, like the US and Canada were at that time. He said, Soenens as well, said the process remains too burdensome and too expensive. So revising the process was not on the conciliar agenda, although Pope Paul VI took tentative steps in that direction in 1969 when he made some minor adjustments to the procedure. But the more sweeping revisions would wait until the Polish Pope was elevated to the papacy. It was through this apostolic constitution that John Paul II revised the process for the first time since 1634. I have put on here, I'm not going to read them all out in the interest of time, but just the major innovations here, reducing miracles. It's very hard to prove a miracle. And in addition to that, as the world of the medically inexplicable shrunk as medical with medical advancements, it got a lot harder. So, for example, if someone was cured from cancer, in the 19th century, that might be a fairly straightforward thing to prove. Whereas by the late 20th century, you'd have to rule out every single experimental treatment that person received, and it just got harder and harder. So that was also part of the conversation. Also, this constitution allowed the local bishop to have more sway in introducing a cause. Previously, the cause had to go through a whole rigmarole just to get even introduced in Rome. It took forever. Replaced the promoter of the faith, or greatly diminished the role of the promoter of the faith, a role popularly known by the term devil's advocate, and featured instead a person called a relator, who was more of a historian. So Ken Woodward, who wrote a book called Making Saints, said that Pope John Paul II fired all the lawyers and hired historians, which as a historian, I think is just a fine idea. But what it did was make the process far less adversarial. So in a sense, everybody was kind of advocating for the saint. There was no devil's advocate whose job it was to give the reasons why the person should be canonized. this was a topic of my last lecture, but that provision that women could only work through a male proxy, that was removed in this, and reduced the waiting period for the introduction of the cause from 50 years to 5 years. So that's something else I should have noted about Blessed Basil. He died in 1973. Under the old rules, his cause for beatification would only be allowed to get started right about now. Sometimes you could cheat a little bit and start a few years in advance of that 50th anniversary. But it was John Paul II that reduced the waiting period to 5 years, in part to create, to hasten the process, but to create models of holiness from our own age, contemporary models. So people that knew him, and surely there are some people in Winnipeg who remember meeting Blessed Basil. And so that was part of the motivation there. I could say more about this if there are questions. I do think the interpretations that John Paul II made the process more democratic are a bit overblown. As I said in my last lecture, in the case of Philippine Duchesne, John Paul II actually went to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints to ask for a saint. He was doing this with a view to canonizing her in the United States, which did not actually happen. But he actually centralized the process a great deal by doing a lot more picking and choosing than his predecessors had done, in part because of his awareness of the symbolic nature of this. He also presided at beatifications, which was not standard practice. Paul VI had done it in the case of Maximilian Kolbe in 1971, but that was an exception, whereas John Paul II made it standard practice. It used to be that the prefect of the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints presided at beatifications. John Paul II provided at them. So he's increasing that control. I did talk a great deal about his first U.S. saint, Philippine Duchesne, last time, who was canonized, if not exactly against the will, then at least against the strong inclination of her community, the RSCJ. And it was a source of division in the community about whether they would go forward, which they eventually did. You may recall, and if you weren't here last time, John Paul II's request to the congregation when he was looking for an American saint was that it be a woman and a religious, not from Philadelphia. Now, I am from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, so as far as I'm concerned, we could have many, many saints from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, but surely what he was thinking of with that request was the fact that John Newman, a Redemptorist I mentioned previously, had just been canonized in 1977. And another cause for canonization of a woman named Catherine Drexel was well underway. And in fact, John Paul II beatified her in 1988. I think they were conscious of not having a preponderance of saints from Philadelphia. I just want to say a few words about Drexel's, I think, remarkable biography. She was born into a wealthy family in Philadelphia, the Drexels, a banking family. Drexel University is named after her uncle. She lived a life of great privilege. She and her two sisters were debutantes, and upon the death of their parents, were in charge of the family's fortune. And they were very generous people. On a grand tour of Europe, they had an audience with Pope Leo XIII in the 1880s. And Catherine, having traveled throughout the United States, begged the Pope to do something to alleviate the great suffering of Native American and African Americans in the United States. And he said to her, "What about you? Why don't you become a missionary?" Catherine recalled bursting into tears at that moment, at that question. And I think in a very holy way, instead of saying, "But I already do so much, I'm already very generous," she allowed that question to really change her life. And in 1891, founded a religious congregation called the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament for Native Americans and colored people. After her death, it became known as simply the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Over the course of her life, she didn't die until 1955. She donated most of her family fortune, her vast family fortune, to building schools and various institutions for Native Americans and African Americans throughout the United States. Neither of her sisters had children, and so the fortune was, and one of them died young, and so the fortune was very much hers. And it's really a wonderful story. Visiting the archives, as I did for writing this book and for other reasons, one of my favorite artifacts from the archives were these tiny pencil stubs that she used to write with. And her practice would be to go to visit the schools run by the congregation and bring brand new shiny pencils and exchange them with the children's pencils, take their well-worn ones so they could have shiny new ones. And to me, that just really captured her holiness, the idea that here was a woman who could have had any shiny thing she had ever wanted, and she chose to write with these pencils. I thought it was very symbolic. Also in those archives are thousands of letters of requests she received for funding, letters exchanged with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt over anti-lynching laws, letters with Catholics who did not believe that Black women had a vocation, were able to have a vocation to religious life. Catherine believed that they did, and she said so quite emphatically. However, not in the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. When Catherine would receive an application, a letter of application from a Native or African American woman, she would refer them to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, a local, in Baltimore, a congregation that had been founded in 1829 for all Black women, one of two only all Black congregations in the United States at that time. Now, I knew this. This was a part of Drexel's cause for canonization. In the context of the civil rights movement, when her cause was introduced, she died in 1955, and her cause was introduced, started to get going about 15 years later when they started to generate advertising for that. They talked about all she had done to advance the cause of African Americans. And when the subject came up of not admitting African American women into her congregation, people said what she had said was that she didn't want to siphon candidates away from the Oblate Sisters of Providence, from the Sisters of Holy Family. And she also noted that she had convents throughout the American South and didn't want to establish two separate convents. So she kind of abided by segregation. So this was not an impediment to her cause at all. And it helped. This is the portrait that appeared during her beatification. So showing her, it's a little, it's something we would not use today, but in 1988 was seen to underscore the work she had done for Native Americans and African Americans. It's interesting. Her work was mostly devoted to children, and the two figures here look more adult. It helped the cause that in 1988, the superior of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament was Sister Juliana Hayes, pictured here. She had become the first African American to enter the congregation during the final years of Drexel's life, and she was the superior by 1988. So that kind of visually helped with Catherine's blind spots, shall we say. Drexel's cause proceeded fairly quickly, and she was beatified on October 1st, 2000. So I want to just focus on that day for a little bit. So this is just 6 months before Blessed Basil and the Ukrainian Catholic martyrs were beatified. This canonization took place in Rome. It was a big one. 120 Chinese martyrs were canonized. They died between 1648 and 1930. So a big spread, but all victims under John Paul II's definition of martyrdom, dying in defense of human dignity. Most had died during the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. Another person canonized on the same day was Josephine Bakita. Remarkable story of a woman who was born in Sudan in 1869 and kidnapped while working in the fields and sold into slavery. She eventually was sold 5 times before she was purchased by the Italian consul in the capital of Sudan, and he sent her to work. After he sent her to work in Italy, she learned more about the church and eventually entered the Canosian order after the Italians' court ruled that Josephine was a free woman who could stay in Italy because slavery was not recognized there. Josephine was another person both beatified and canonized by John Paul II. And she was beatified in 1992, canonized in 2000. And she is regarded as the first modern African saint. So recognizing, of course, that St. Augustine and the ancient church, before the process of canonization, there were certainly saints from Africa. But the first saint from Sudan. And again, John Paul II's recognition of how meaningful it was to name a saint from among a population that did not have one. Josephine Bakita's story has gained a lot of traction in recent years. Her feast day is February 8th, and that has been designated the International Day Against Human Trafficking. So her story is lifted up on that day by many women religious and by many organizations that are working to end modern slavery. The same cannot be said of Catherine Drexel, that her story continues to be lifted up. And in fact, there's more and more critique emerging of Drexel post her canonization for her failure to recognize that Black women had a place in the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. And I mentioned this in my first lecture, but one of my points is that the lives of these people don't change, but the way we interpret their lives changes. Our world changes. And I have to say that were I to have given this lecture last March, when I was supposed to have done so, I would not have done this deep dive into Drexel's cause. But over the last year, I've had a very significant change of heart regarding Catherine's story, a person who I have still admire, but I really admired a great deal. And it had everything to do with the horrific events of the last year in terms of racial reckoning in the United States. Shortly after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last June, I had to go to my office, kind of snuck into my office. It was still kind of closed, the campus in lockdown, because I needed to find some sources for something else that I was writing. And I had in my Drexel files letters, copies of letters she had written to those young women, the young Black women who had asked for admission to her congregation. And I read again her words in which she said, essentially, yes, you have a vocation, but you don't belong with us. You belong with them. I had read those letters a million times, and to me, they were just part of a complicated story that was overshadowed by all that Drexel had done in her lifetime. She's certainly done more than any U.S. Catholic to provide education and help to African Americans. And that was the primary part of that story. But reading it in the wake of the events of last June, the letters actually broke my heart. I saw her for what she was, a supporter of segregation. I read her in a new way. And consequently, I've thought a lot about this the last year, and I've become very supportive of the cause for canonization of Mother Mary Lange, who was the founder of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Mother Mary Lange is one of 6 causes of African Americans from the United States that are now being advanced. And many of them, I think, are advancing very quickly, and I hope that they will be named saints soon. But it was a really powerful recognition on my part. Again, someone who's written a lot about the way that our interpretations of saints change as the world changes. And here it happened with a person whose life story I had known intimately and spent years studying and even writing about. I saw these letters in a new way. I'm going to say a little bit more about that at the end, but I want to move now to another change of heart or change of thinking I had in relation to the last year, and that has to do with the release of the McCarrick Report last November. As I mentioned, John Paul II was canonized very quickly. I won't go into all the details of the McCarrick Report, although I'm happy to talk about it in the question period. But There is no question that John Paul II is implicated in that. This is a report commissioned by the Vatican Secretary of State, densely footnoted, and it shows how the former Cardinal McCarrick rose up through the ranks, enjoyed the favor of many officials, but above all, John Paul II, who I think demonstrated willful ignorance against powerful evidence that McCarrick was an abuser of the seminarians in his care. And I believe that this doesn't change his canonization. There was a lot of talk when this report first emerged about, well, should he be decanonized or thing? First of all, that's not even a thing. That doesn't happen. But what I do think is that this particular instance shows that he was canonized probably too quickly. And whereas before, I was a big fan of that change of the reduction of the 50-year requirement to the 5-year requirement, I think that some longer requirement should be put back in until we give historians the time to do their work and until the picture becomes clearer, as it only does through time. So I am not, would never say that John Paul II isn't a saint. That is not something I or any person can say, but I do think that he was canonized too quickly in the wake of evidence. And I say this because a very popular case in the United States, the case of Fulton Sheen, who was a very well-known radio evangelist and then television evangelist. His cause for canonization, which is spearheaded out of the Diocese of Peoria, Illinois, where he was born, his beatification was actually scheduled for December of 2019. And a week before, the Bishop of Peoria received notice that it had to be canceled because Sheen had served as Bishop of Rochester for 3 years in the late 1960s. And there was some suggestion that he had been involved in a cover-up of sexual abuse. I think this, in effect, puts a halt to Sheen's cause. I have no inside information on this, and certainly I feel terrible for his devotees and for the people that worked so hard to bring it to that. But it fits with the larger interpretation of canonization, which is that we canonize people not for them. Canonization changes nothing about the people so honored, but it is the people that we lift up. And there is so much we don't yet know about clergy sexual abuse and who was implicated. And so if you think back to my second lecture, when I talked about how Seton's cause was almost entirely derailed because the hint of scandal, I think this is what we're going to see with any man who served in high office in the church in the second half of the 20th century. I think we're going to see the danger of allegations like this coming up. I want to end by talking about how I see this in the larger scheme of things, and how I want to make clear I don't think this is a reason not to think that John Paul II or Catherine Drexel or Fulton Sheen do not dwell in God's holy presence. Canonization, remember, just affirms that. It doesn't put them in that presence. It affirms that they've been there from the moment of their deaths. But I do think that in terms of holding them up as holy heroes, we are going to hear less about them, not because of something that was revealed necessarily in their lives, something that wasn't already known, but because of the way the world has changed. In this case, just since in the last year, what we know about Theodore McCarrick, for one, and the racial reckoning we're certainly having, we continue to have in the United States. But I want to end on a more positive note that I hope will flesh out some of the ideas I've been talking about for the last couple months. This is another one of the potential African-American saints, a woman named Thea Bowman, who was a Franciscan who died in 1990. Her cause for canonization is now open. Last summer, Loyola University Chicago renamed a residence hall that had been named after Flannery O'Connor in honor of Thea, in part because of revelations about Flannery O'Connor and her correspondence, in which she demonstrated racial insensitivity, to say the least. Again, in the wake of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, this changed Flannery O'Connor's legacy. So Thea Bowman was someone that I decided to spend a little more time with this summer, in part after I read, I hope you can see the whole thing here. I read a biography that was written by a Redemptorist. Redemptorists are kind of all over this lecture, named Father Maurice Nutt. He had written an article on June 19th, 2020, that appeared in the Mississippi Catholic, who talked about Thea's story as a witness to the possibility of racial healing and reconciliation. He said a lot of other things about her. He was her student, he knew her well, and as I said, he was this, he wrote her biography. Thea had become the first Black woman to enter a Franciscan community in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and left an indelible imprint on the Catholic Church in America through her leadership as a founding member of the Institute for Black Catholic Studies at Xavier University in New Orleans. I got to know Father Maurice over the summer, and we talked a lot about his biography and about Sister Thea. And he had taught for many years at Xavier University. And I asked him what he thought about Catherine Drexel and shared with him my realization and discomfort with her life story. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, yes, Catherine Drexel was a segregationist. It's a hard word to hear in 2020, 2021. But he has no doubt that Catherine is counted among the saints and that she is in God's eternal presence. And here's the reason. For Father Maurice, this is the heart of the matter. Catherine Drexel had founded in 1915 Xavier University, the place where he, many other African-American Catholics, and Sister Thea had trained and studied and found their own calling and their own path to holiness. So for Father Maurice, Thea's story is absolutely intertwined with Catherine Drexel's story. Without Catherine, Thea could not have been Thea. I love this story because it reminds us, and here I'm speaking less as a historian and more as a woman of faith, this story about the interwoven lives of Catherine and Thea, who never met in person, but who were linked through Xavier University, remind us of the paradox of the call to sanctity, a call that compels us to live contrary to the ways of the world, even as we absorb the biases and even the sinfulness of the imperfect worlds that we inhabit. This is a paradox that's resolved only in God's time and with God's transforming grace. And they teach us that Catherine Drexel's shortcomings and John Paul II's shortcomings and even sins are not cause for condemnation or cancellation, but reasons for consolation. God calls us to be holy, not perfect, and thank goodness. Again, canonization does not change anything about all the people I've talked about. On that happy day when I hope Blessed Vasil is canonized along with the other Ukrainian martyrs, and I hope you invite me to the celebrations that will surely happen in Rome and Winnipeg. We will celebrate only that he entered God's eternal life at the moment of his death in 1973. We canonize people for us and to learn from them. And canonization reveals a great deal about the people of God and the way the church has changed over time. I find it inspiring as a person of faith and absolutely fascinating as a historian. And I hope that fascination has been communicated to you in the now 3 hours we have spent together over the last couple months. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. And what a way to finish off the three series, Dr. Sprows Cummings. I think we'll now go into questions, and you can provide the answers if you're able to. And people can use the Q&A function or the chat function and at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And those who are watching on Facebook, they can type in their question and Jason can let us know. So I don't see any questions yet, but just to start things off, I do want to ask you, what are the differences now with Pope Francis? You know, Pope John Paul II really made some major changes that which you identified so well in your lecture. But I'm wondering, are there significant changes that we should be aware of regarding Pope Francis?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that's another reason why that 1341, the number of blesseds, is so important, because there's it created kind of a backlog for John Paul II's successors. And in fact, Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger at the CDF in 1989, published an article under the title, Troppo Santi, are there too many saints? Actually, he was quoted in the article. He didn't write the article, but he actually questioned the pace of canonizations. And were we being a little too hasty in naming all these saints? And so, and he said the same thing after his elevation on Vatican Radio. He said, yeah, I think we could stand to slow it down a little. Well, he didn't slow it down, in part because of all those blesseds who were getting miracles, and he canonized many people. And the same is true of Pope Francis. Yes, I think Pope Francis is also very aware of the symbol of it. It was Pope Francis, not John Paul II, that presided over the first canonization in the United States, which didn't happen until 2015. So although there had been many canonizations that happened, 14 that happened outside of the Vatican during the pontificate of John Paul II, it was Pope Francis that did that. And I think he picked a Spanish missionary to California, Junipero Serra. And I have the reasons I believe he picked them. I think that was a difficult choice for a lot of reasons, but he's also created a new path to sanctity called a sacrifice of life, which is not all that dissimilar from what John Paul II recognized, but he's also recognizing that. He's done a lot of, I should have said that despite all these rules, the Pope can do whatever he pleases when it comes to canonization. So in the case of Marie of the Incarnation, he canonized her in 2014 without a miracle, the same of Bishop Laval of Quebec. So he's showed a tendency to kind of be, to play fast and loose with the process, which is his entitlement. He also recently, a beatification that got a lot of attention was the beatification of Blessed Carlo Acutis, who became the first millennial blessed just last fall. And I think in that respect, Francis is very much in line with John Paul II in wanting to create those contemporary models.
Great. So I have a few questions coming in, and here's from another Francis. Emmanuel Ebbe Francis asks, I would like to know, were there any controversies leading to the canonization of Josephina Bakhita?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. I haven't studied her cause in depth. I just know that she was canonized, and I know there's not any controversy I'm aware of now, and I'd be surprised because of the attention she gets on her feast day each year, which is actually, that attention increases each year. So I am not aware of any, no. I do know there was a lot of celebration in Sudan and in fact throughout Africa when she was canonized, but I'm not aware of any. I'd be happy to hear about some if there are any.
So this question is from Julian Fredette from across the river at the St. Boniface Archdiocese. Last month, you mentioned two martyrs to their faith and who worked for the people they loved and served, namely Sister Dorothy Stang, murdered in Brazil, and Sister Maura Clark, murdered in El Salvador. Two questions. Are they honored as saints in their communities? And two, do you see them as ever being named saints, for which they certainly are in the future?
They are absolutely honored as saints in their local communities. Dorothy's biography is Martyr of the Amazon. She is beloved in Brazil and in Ohio, and beloved. I think she also got a lot of attention during Laudato Si, after the promulgation of Laudato Si. The same is true of Sister Maura and the other church woman who died with her in El Salvador. Their causes are not open, and one of the reasons that is given for that is that they are honored as people saints. They are recognized as such, and many of the people who were close to them say, we don't need Rome to tell us that they're saints. We know that they are. That is certainly a powerful response, and one I sympathize with, especially since I know how difficult it is to get through a process. Here's my concern. do I ever see them being named saints? Not unless someone opens their causes. And I think what we have here is the issue of historical memory. Everyone that knew these women, I did these calculations not long ago, and I think Sister Maura would have been about 80 about now. So she would have died a natural death had she been permitted to live out a natural life. Everyone that knew them is going to die. That's just a fact. So surely people who didn't meet them know their stories and are inspired by them. I didn't meet any of these women, and I find them very inspiring. But eventually, I mean, the way you keep stories alive is through telling them over and over again through generations. And so my concern is that if they are not beatified or canonized, their names are not going to be on shrines. Or remember, you have to be officially through the process before public veneration can happen. So while they are privately venerated, those avenues for public veneration are not open to them. So 100 years from now, when everyone who knew them personally, and many that even remember their stories, have died, will there be a parish named after St. Dorothy Stang? I think that's a powerful argument to proceed with canonization, recognizing that it's very hard. I see there's another question. Might there be people who are saints but never known, recognized, or acknowledged? There certainly are. Absolutely. Most, a very, very small percentage of people who we believe dwell in God's eternal presence are recognized for that and venerated as such. And so, of course, yes. But the question is, who do we lift up and why and when? So to go back to my ruminations on Sister Thea and Mother Mary Lange, those are stories that resonate very powerfully. The experiences of racism in their lives. Another saint who's just being introduced from Chicago is Father Augustus Tolton, who was the first openly Black priest in the United States, who was not accepted to a seminary in the United States. He had to study in Rome and be ordained there because of his race. His cause for canonization is open. And I think those stories are the stories we need to hear today. And I think the same is true of many of these church women. So yes, of course, there are people who will never be known or recognized. And again, we don't canonize them to change anything about them. We canonize them for us. Who are the models we need today?
So I see you answered Farah Noreen's question. So thank you, Farah, for that. Dr. Chris Butterall is asking, in this cancel culture of today, is it possible to revoke a sainthood, like taking back an Olympic medal?
Well, I mean, people are not, there's no process to revoke it. What there is there are saints who have been removed from the universal calendar. But it's mostly because of things like, it's revealed that maybe they didn't exist, like St. Christopher, for example.
Yes, I'm well aware of that one.
Yeah, sorry. If you didn't know, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, but, is he more based on the legend of the Christ bearer? So, and again, I mean, this is not what I am saying. It's not about taking back. It's not about canceling a person like John Paul II or Catherine Drexel. It's about shifting the focus from, they are our holy models for today, when they were holy, but they were not perfect. And they had blind spots that we share. And maybe going through this experience that I did with Catherine Drexel, which was very moving for me, I know that helped me become aware of my own blind spots and how I've stated publicly many times that, well, yeah, that was true about Catherine, that she didn't accept Black women, but she did these other things. And I think we have to come to terms with it. So I don't see it as akin to cancel culture. I see it as almost a consolation that these are people. We talked about Dorothy Day a little bit last time, and she is reported to have said, "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be so easily dismissed." That saints are not people who are on pedestals, who we can never hope to be like. But in fact, they're people who share the same biases and inhabit the same sinful worlds as we do, and we're called to be holy. So I don't see it as akin to cancel culture.
Great, thank you. And I see one or two people have raised their hands. If they could type it into the Q&A box, that'd be great. Here's a question from Michael Herman. Kudos for this wonderful series. I've been interested in saints and hagiography for years, and this has added another layer to my interest. One Picayune, boy, there are lots of good words in here, comment, I'm wondering if I've been mispronouncing Marguerite de Bourgoy's name. Bourgoy is an older version of bourgeois. I apologize for this level of nerdiness.
Never any need to apologize for nerdiness to me, Michael. Thank you for your comment. And I'm sure I'm the one mispronouncing it. I was worried about the Ukrainian, but the only languages other than English that I speak are Italian and Spanish. So I don't claim any. I'm sure you're right.
So from Jim Mulville, and Jim is the past dean of social work here at the University of Manitoba and a member of our college. A number of years ago, I remember an announcement from the Vatican that a number of early saints that were removed from the list due to their stories being found to be legend rather than fact, St. Christopher of card dashboard fame, was on the list. Is there such a culling process that takes place on a regular basis?
Yeah, that process, I mentioned that Pope Paul VI had made some modifications to the process in 1969. He changed the name of the dicastery from the Sacred Congregation of Rites to the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints. And he did that was the culling process where St. Christopher got the boot. Although I don't think it has affected his devotional culture. You can still purchase all of those things. I mean, I think that was a pretty thorough culling process that removed so many of the ones who had not gone through the process. Remember, the process was only developed, started to be developed in like the 10th century and was only really codified by 1634. So anything like in the first millennium of the church, I think there would be a lot of potential for that there. But I think if a person has been through the process, they're safe. But I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any regular culling process.
So here's from Stefan Leake. Thank you very much for the talk, Dr. Sprows Cummings. Do you think that John Paul II's record appointment of cardinals from places outside of Western Europe came out of a similar motivation as his canonization drive for European saints? And then additionally, do you think that John Paul II's Polish origins influenced his search for saints outside of Western Europe?
Absolutely. Yes to both questions. I quoted Cardinal Sunan saying that 90% of saints came from 3 European countries. He didn't specify which ones they were, but I'm sure they're Italy, Spain, and France. And I haven't checked that, by the way. That's just a quote from him. But I think absolutely that's why he traveled so much outside of Europe. It's why he changed the geography of the College of Cardinals. And while he tried, I was in Rome. I didn't attend his beatification, but I was in Rome for when he was beatified in 2011. And I was staying at a guest house where there were many sisters from Africa. And they were just elated. I loved talking to them about their excitement because he was their saint. So because he had been to their continent and he had canonized Bakita. And, and I was just really struck by how he was able to diversify and it affirmed his sense of canonization as a symbolic tool, really. Not only that, but as a way to bind a population closer to the church when you name a saint from a population that doesn't have one. So that was very early on in my research. I was struck by that.
So Farah Noreen, just following up on your St. Christopher, asks, what about St. George and the Dragon? But I seem to recall that he was culled out at the same time as Christopher.
He may have been. I'm not sure, and I don't want to offend all the Georges that I know by saying if he was. I mean, certainly legend is very much a part of his story, and so many. I mean, Saint Bridget, right, among the Irish, a beloved saint among the Irish. She seems to have been real. She existed, but yet so much of her story was melded with pre-Christian Ireland. So I think a lot of times it's, it's,
Well,
Yeah.
St. Bridget, we know that there is a fox, but we know there's no such thing as a dragon, right? So here's a question from somebody who's married to a George, Dr. Emeka Sasmary, the past president of the University of Manitoba and a member of our college. She says, I appreciate your comment that we are not called to be perfect. However, children are taught to emulate saints. What suggestion could you give parents and teachers when difficult questions arise about people who made mistakes, such as the recently canonized saints you mentioned today?
She has always asked wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Yes, I think about this a lot. And I think what I did, admittedly not in too much depth in this short time together, but the juxtaposition of Thea Bowman and Catherine Drexel is how I have come to think about sanctity, and being exposed to all of these stories and so many more stories and models of holiness that John Paul II created and that I think Pope Francis is also doing. There's no shortage of a supply. So I think saying, yes, this person was holy in this way. I don't believe that I haven't changed my belief that Catherine Drexel was a holy person, but I see her much more clearly as a person of her time than I did before. And so that is now part of her story. But I had a student last semester write a wonderful paper advocating for the canonization of Mary Elizabeth Lange, saying that if Drexel, because African Americans celebrated wildly when Drexel was canonized in 2000 and when she was beatified in 1988. Graduates of Xavier University testified in her cause for canonization. People who were members of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who had been sent there by Drexel when they were rejected from her congregation, testified in terms of her, that she was a holy person. But I think now that we have these stories of saints who were themselves Black Catholics, that is another avenue. I remember I was asked by a person when Tolton's cause was started, and he was a formerly enslaved person, and this person who was kind of high up in the archdiocese said, well, I don't understand why we're canonizing him, because he was enslaved, and lots of people were enslaved, and I just said, we're not canonizing him for him. We're doing it for us, so we can learn more about the church's complicity in slavery, in racism. And that was, again, I was very early on in my own thinking at that point, but I think that's true. So I guess I would say, what can we learn from these stories? I'm writing about the clergy sexual abuse scandal right now, which is very hard to write about, and people who were good people were complicit in this. John Paul II was not alone in being duped by Cardinal McCarrick. I knew him. I met him, found him a very charming man. He was a regular at Notre Dame. So I guess I would use the stories of the saints as what I do with the stories of all the people I talk about and write about in history, as is something we can learn from the mistakes of the past, but also imagine a new future.
Great. So we've pretty well run out of time for questions, but I did want to ask you, is this a new book that you're writing on, or are these some journal pieces?
Oh, on clergy sex abuse? Well, I'm directing a project at the Cushwa Center called Gender, Sex, and Power, the clergy sexual abuse in the U.S. Catholic Church. And so I direct a working group we have 16 scholars who are all working on pieces. And I'm working on, at this point, it's an article. It may be a book. It's kind of too soon to tell, but I can tell you it's very difficult after spending as long as I did writing about saints. Not that there were not stories of sin and difficult stories to read in that. This is very difficult material, but it's absolutely necessary to know what happened. That's why the McCarrick Report, very difficult to read, but a remarkable document. Some of the publications about the clergy sex abuse scandal are dismissed because they say, well, they don't know how the Catholic Church operates or something. Well, this report details exactly how the Catholic Church operates. It was commissioned by the Vatican, and there's so much rich detail in there. And I think we're only scratching the surface. So I think it's really important. I think before 2018, If you had asked me about the clergy abuse scandal, I would say, yes, well, obviously, that's an important subject, but I am not a person who focuses on, that's not my particular area of focus. And I now believe that you can't actually be a credible scholar of the American Catholic experience and not engage it to some extent. That's not to say that's the only thing I'm going to write about, but it is so embedded. I mean, that Fulton Sheen, just little story, they're kind of this icon of the mid 20th century America. We have to know about it. So telling those stories, I think, are imperative. So just as we tell the stories of saints, we also have to tell the story of sinners.
Well, thanks very much. So we've come to the end of our session, and I just want to say thank you very much for these lectures. I also want to express gratitude for those who helped make this lecture happen over the 3 months that you've stuck with us, and we've been mesmerized by your lectures. I first want to thank the Hanley Lecture Selections Committee, including Christine Butterell, John Stapleton, John Stafford, and Daniel McLeod. We went through a number of names, and your name came up as a very distinguished person to invite. I want to thank the Logistics Committee, including Bonnie Warkentine, Lisa McCausland, and Matt Sumshishin. And Matt also handled all the marketing and advertising for this lecture, and John Funk, who designed the posters and other materials. And we'll mail you one of those posters so you can put it up on your wall. Jason Brennan, also we want to thank, who handled the technical logistics for setting up this webinar. And finally, we're thankful to the founding donors to the Father Hanley Fund and those who continue to donate to make this lecture possible. And for those who are able, who are part of this audience right now or watching on YouTube, please donate to our St. Paul's College Foundation through the CanadaHelps.org website under the St. Paul's College Foundation. And you'll see the Hanley Lecture drop-down box for dedicating your donation to this lecture series. So to conclude, thank you, Dr. Sprows Cummings, for providing these 3 stimulating and engaging lectures. And we hope we can have you come in person to our fair city on a future day, maybe with less snow than we have today. And I want to say thank you to all the audience here who were here for this lecture and the last 2. It's been wonderful hearing the questions and just knowing that we have a large amount of interest in what you had to say. So thanks very much. And I hope everybody has a very good rest of the day. And those in Winnipeg, please drive safely with all the snow outside.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor.
Thanks, Kathleen.